Hello everyone, this is episode 7 of Emergency Jazz with James. Welcome. Throughout this series, I've been emphasising jazz's roots in the rhythmic, melodic and harmonic techniques of West African music. Well, after developing across the Atlantic in the US and Latin America, the 1950s saw jazz influence cropping up across the African continent, leading to some of the most innovative new music of the 20th century. Jazz had come home. Now, you may not have heard of some of these artists today, but you won't be forgetting their music anytime soon. Strap yourselves in for some unbelievable artistic talents today and some of the most irresistible grooves yet. Jazz had found its way to Africa in the first half of the 20th century in the form of recordings and the odd concert. But it wasn't until the 1950s when its influence surged and African musicians started fusing their own techniques with those of African jazz on a professional level. Why did this happen now, though, and not in the 1930s? Well, technology was improving, so new vinyl LPs and cheaper record players were more readily available. And 50s jazz, as we've heard, was pretty fantastic. So it's difficult to see how anyone could resist such musical influences. But there is another, more calculated reason that certainly played a role in jazz's resurgence here. The start of decolonization in Africa also coincided with the rising tensions of the Cold War. And American musicians like Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie were strategically sent to Africa, sometimes by the CIA, as cultural diplomats to sway fledgling nations away from communist influences. Also, American jazz carried with it the power of the civil rights struggle and messages of racial equality from musicians like Nina Simone, Charles Mingus and John Coltrane. And this was a message that resonated strongly with oppressed peoples and cultures across Africa. This was a time of great suffering, but there were also glimmers of hope as decolonization and radical political change started to seem possible. And music and culture were powerful tools in creating and reforming societies, and Africa's new independent nations were keen to show their artistic worth on the international stage. Jazz's roots in West African techniques meant that it could be fused with local musics like it had never left. So the reason for jazz's resurgence in Africa in the 50s was that the US had been strategically exporting jazz back to Africa alongside ordinary record sales. The terrible irony of which was that whilst exporting jazz as an exemplar of American society, African American communities across the United States continued and continue to be horribly oppressed. Whilst the US may have been the spark for this influence, African musicians took these sounds and developed them to the forefront of musical innovation in the 20th century. Let's dive into this rich musical world, and first we shall travel to South Africa. In South Africa, where the apartheid was raging in all its terror, jazz's social message was a big problem for white nationalists. Jazz represented what the apartheid government feared most, an internationally respected music born of the social mixing of black and white artists. The apartheid government even attempted to censor jazz in the early 50s, but its influences were too numerous and extensive. And so, despite government pressure, the first modern South African jazz album was recorded in 1959 by a band called the Jazz Epistles, which was formed of pianist Abdullah Ibrahim, saxophonist Kippie Moeketsi, trombonist Jonas Gwangwa, trumpeter Hugh Masekela, and bassist Johnny Gertz. This hard bop inspired group drew directly from Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, but fused this with Mbaqanga dance styles and harmonies from Cape Town townships. Their 1959 album was called Jazz Epistle Verse 1, but shockingly, it was almost lost to the world. Only 500 copies were initially made, and they had to be buried to avoid the censorship of the state, only to be dug up and exported years later. Let's listen to this track, Blues for Huey, and the short, call and response hard bop style melodic phrases, but also the effortless groove and captivating close parallel harmony with strong South African influences. Note particularly the movement in major ninths for the bass and trumpet, which is extremely unusual. It is impossible to overstate the importance of this band. Here was a collection of black musicians playing music on the cutting edge of musical innovation. For the apartheid regime, this modern, urban music explicitly shattered the government's propaganda message of the limitations of black South African culture. Shortly after this album broke, the Jazz Epistles collaborated with Todd Matshikiza in an all-African jazz opera called King Kong, designed to advertise the power and beauty of African art. Its story of a boxer had an all-black cast and starred the country's finest singer, Miriam Makeba. Remember her for later. The Jazz Epistles, with the musical, toured across Europe in 1960, but this coincided with several atrocities in South Africa, like the banning of the African National Congress and the murder of 69 peaceful protesters in Sharpeville. So rather than return to subjugation, after the tour, the members of the Jazz Epistles split and spread across the world, taking the beauty of South African jazz wherever they went as a message of racial equality and condemnation of the apartheid regime. Sadly, until the fall of apartheid, the story of South African jazz from 1960 onwards is a story of exiled musicians. Jazz Epistles pianist Abdullah Ibrahim, previously known as Dollar Brand, journeyed around Europe from 1960 to 1965, and here he ran into Duke Ellington in Zurich. After hearing Ibrahim's trio, the Duke, enthralled by their unique sound, set them up with a recording contract that would take Ibrahim to European fame and eventually onto the US, where he would work extensively with musicians like Ornette Coleman, Don Cherry and John Coltrane. From the early 1970s, Ibrahim started to make occasional trips to South Africa, now as a US citizen, and here he refined his jazz fusion style with local saxophonist Basil Coetzee. Eventually, they found the right formula of sounds, and a new genre developed that would become known as Cape Jazz. And it was in this style that they wrote one of the most powerful protest songs of the 60s, and this was Manenberg, a piece inspired by the forced relocation of thousands of black residents away from white neighbourhoods and into townships near Cape Town. Manenberg, the song, was a guided collective improvisation recorded in just a single take in Cape Town, June 1974. This piece was a musical landmark in ensemble improvisation technique and also jazz fusion, as it incorporated elements from multiple South African musical styles, including marabi instruments, tiki dry beat patterns, and melismatic langarm melodic contours. This fusion of styles was a provocative message to the apartheid government of the beauty of combining musical traditions. It became an anthem of anti-apartheid protests, which is particularly remarkable considering the song has no lyrics. Just hearing the different musical traditions combined in a single performance was a powerful enough message. As we listen to this piece now, you'll also notice some strange extended instrumental techniques, most notably Ibrahim's piano itself, which has thumbtacks attached to the hammers, which gives it a metallic timbre reminiscent of the Umbira thumb piano. Check this out. Another key South African figure was Miriam Makeba, the lead singer from that King Kong musical, remember? Unlike Ibrahim, she immediately made her way to New York, along with her husband King Kong co-star and Jazz Epistles trumpeter Hugh Masekela, who also had a successful jazz career in the US. Makeba used her unique compositional voice and remarkable vocal talent to broadcast anti-racist messages throughout her artistic career. And she was perhaps the first South African musician of any kind to reach international fame with her 1966 song, Pata Pata. This was a jazz, soul, Afro-pop fusion that drew from the dance rhythms of the Shebeen townships around Johannesburg. Listen to this song, and in particular note the blues harmonies into her vocal lines and the mixture of Western and African percussion instruments. In the following years, Miriam Makeba performed and sang throughout Africa, including many ceremonies of new countries' independence. She was an unwavering thorn in the side of apartheid propaganda, and after the apartheid was dismantled in 1990, Makeba returned to South Africa and played a key role again in the peace and reconciliation that followed. She continued to record and perform upon returning to South Africa, including a 1991 album, Eyes on Tomorrow, which featured international superstars Dizzy Gillespie and Nina Simone. In recognition of her humanitarian achievements, she was named a UN Goodwill Ambassador in 1999, and she continued to campaign for humanitarian causes all the way until her death in 2008. Another country with jazz music at the heart of its civil rights struggle was what would become known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In 1960, Congolese national movement leader Patrice Lumumba led a political delegation to Brussels to negotiate his country's independence. And with him, he brought some of the country's finest musicians as cultural ambassadors. Amongst them was Joseph Kabasele, who had impressed Lumumba and the entire country with his jazz fusion band, L'Africa Jazz. Kabasele drew from the Cuban son clave technique and combined it with local rhythmic principles and jazz harmony to create what became known as Congolese rumba, or soukous music. Throughout the mid-50s, Kabasele's popularity across the capital Leopoldville, now called Kinshasa, rose to an unparalleled level, and internationally, jazz artists started to pay attention. Whilst in Brussels in 1960, Kabasele and his L'Africa Jazz wrote, quite simply, one of the most important songs of social change of the entire 20th century, Indépendance Cha-Cha. This song drew heavily from jazz harmonic structures, jazz ensemble communication and soloing styles, but also used lyrics in Lingala, not French, which was an important innovation. And of course, it featured a host of West African percussion instruments. On top of the fused musical aesthetics, the lyrics of Indépendance Cha-Cha were written to educate people back home in the Congo about the new democratic system. The lyrics literally include the names of the major political parties you could vote for, as well as instructions on how to register to vote. Let's listen to this groundbreaking song with its mixture of clean electric guitar, kora, and extensive African, Caribbean, and Western percussion instruments. Also note the slow-moving harmony and increased emphasis on textural evolution.
Indépendance, cha-cha, tozumiye. Oki kwanza, cha-cha, tubakidi. Otableron, cha-cha, baganye.
To the people. Now we travel to the other side of the continent, to Ethiopia, a country that had a rather different political experience of the 20th century, predominantly because apart from a military invasion by the Italians from 1935 to 1941, Ethiopia remained free from colonial occupation for the entire 20th century. Ethiopian classical music developed extremely differently to its West African counterparts, in a large part because of Ethiopia's proximity to Arab cultures. The music of the Ethiopian highlands, for example, uses a modal system of pentatonic scales called the genet, which is highly reminiscent of Arab scale systems. Pentatonic scales, by the way, are just scales with 5 notes in them. Some of these scales have minor characteristics, like the tezzetta, and others are slightly stranger, starting on minor seconds, like the ambasel. However, it's important to note that whilst I've just played those scales on the piano, traditionally Ethiopian classical music would not have been equally tempered. Now, what on earth do I mean by that? Well, equal temperament is what Western music and jazz relies upon. It is the 12 equal divisions of the octave that we know as semitones. So why am I talking to you about Ethiopian classical scales? Well, despite the differences in tuning, these modes of Ethiopian classical music are analogous to the modes we use in jazz improvisation, and some of them correspond directly. That tezzetta scale that we heard is basically an Aeolian pentatonic. Here's the tezzetta scale, and here is a normal Aeolian minor mode. They're really similar. Also, the ambasel that we heard is basically a Phrygian pentatonic. That sounds very fun, never said that sentence before. Here's a normal Phrygian scale in Western style. They're almost exactly the same. These scales, despite originating thousands of miles away from West Africa, were poised for a jazz fusion explosion. And the first to realise this wonderful potential was Ethiopian musician Mulatu Astatke, another musician who, if you've never heard of before, you won't be forgetting anytime soon. Along with Ethiopian classical scales, Astatke employed Latin rhythms, wah-wah pedal guitars, and learnt to blend all of these textures together with the harmonic language of jazz in London, alongside Ghanaian Afro-pop saxophonist Teddy Osei. Mulatu's broad palette of colours, combined with Ethiopian classical music's Arabic-inspired scale system, became Ethio-jazz, a fusion genre with a different aesthetic to any other African jazz style. Meanwhile, back in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, Emperor Haile Selassie had made several liberal changes to his society following the turmoil of 1960, and the capital city was in full cultural swing. And it was in this environment that Astatke decided to return home to share his Ethio-jazz with Ethiopia. Considered somewhat of a radical with his unconventional music and signature vibraphone solo instrument, Astatke's music was initially met with mistrust, as many Ethiopians feared cultural contamination in the political turmoil that was the mid-20th century. Astatke persevered though, and established an Ethiopian jazz quintet, and this produced 2 hugely successful albums, Afro-Latin Soul 1 and 2 in 1966, and Mulatu of Ethiopia in 1972. Let's listen to Mulatu's signature vibraphone sound in a song called Shagu from his 1966 record. In 1973, Astatke, to his delight, was chosen to perform with Duke Ellington when he toured Ethiopia, again probably as part of a US cultural warfare program against the Soviet Union. Astatke and Ellington formed a strong friendship, and together they performed some of Astatke's own music in front of Emperor Haile Selassie, and all of this was despite the Duke suffering from terminal lung cancer that would take his life just a few months later. Now, just a year later, in 1974, Selassie was deposed, and a Soviet-backed military junta took over in a period of cultural repression. A strict curfew put an end to Addis's thriving nightlife, and this led to many musicians leaving the country, but not Astatke. He stuck it out, teaching music to younger artists, and he even managed to record some albums under this new regime. His music inspired a generation of Ethiopian fusion styles, and he's recognised as somewhat of a godfather of the compilation albums, the Ethiopiques, which continue to this day to advertise young Ethiopian musicians across the world. Around the same time, several American musicians, taking inspiration from Astatke Makeba and Ibrahim, started to be heavily influenced by the Afro-jazz fusion worlds. And this was linked with the Black Power movement as increasingly African Americans embraced aspects of their West African ancestry. And no one championed these musical influences more than Brooklyn-born Randy Weston, who in 1960 produced a landmark big band album celebrating decolonization and the value and beauty of African music. The album was called Uhuru Afrika, and it was arranged in full by trombonist-composer superstar Melba Liston. This was a vast jazz suite using a 24-piece big band, instruments from across West Africa, a collaboration with poet Langston Hughes, and an array of African and African-American musicians. This album played a huge role in how African jazz fusions were valued internationally. So much so that it was actually banned in apartheid South Africa. That tells you everything you need to know. Weston continued to experiment with the boundaries of Afro-jazz fusion with Ghanaian and Nigerian influences in his next albums of High Life and Blue Moses. But for now, let's listen to a section from part 1 of that 1960 Uhuru suite so you can hear this powerful music in action. In addition to their own incredible music and social messages, Abdullah Ibrahim, Miriam Makeba, Joseph Kabasele and Mulatu Astatke inspired a new generation of performers that today grace the international stages of the 21st century. Performers like pianist, composer and singer Tundi Untuli, trombonist Sia Makuzeni and guitarist Jimmy Dludu. I've put all of them in this week's playlist. Please go and listen to their beautiful music. There are two musicians I haven't mentioned today because they fall just ahead of us chronologically, but both convey similarly powerful socio-musical messages. The first is Mali's Salif Keita, who grew out of the government-sponsored jazz-inspired Rail Band, but then went on to almost single-handedly create Afro-pop. Salif Keita combined a voice of pure gold with musical techniques from Cuba, Spain, Portugal, the Middle East and Mali. Keita found himself more aligned with jazz from the 1990s onwards, actually, and even more in the last couple of years with collaborations with bands like Snarky Puppy. The other notable omission is Fela Kuti, the Nigerian multi-instrumentalist, civil rights activist and pioneer of Afrobeat music, which is a complex fusion of jazz, funk, Ghanaian highlife, psychedelic rock, and traditional West African chants and rhythms. We come tantalisingly close to his story as it begins properly in the late 70s, but again, we'll be hearing a lot more about Fela in later episodes. We have seen from the very first episode of Emergency Jazz to now how the relationship between Africa and jazz in the United States is extensive. Africa was one of the key sources of jazz's rhythmic and harmonic techniques as it developed in the US. But then in the 1950s, the music returned across the Atlantic to spark a new wave of jazz in Africa. But then this music came back to inspire American musicians in the 70s and beyond, and so the cycle of collaboration continues to this day. I hope that today I've shown you not only just some beautiful new music, but I also hope to have kindled in you a new appreciation for all jazz, having been reminded of the powerful social messages that this music has conveyed. Tragically, we still see rampant institutionalised racism around the world, So the messages of Miriam Makeba and Joseph Cabaselli should be as relevant and as powerful as ever. The next time you play a Dorian scale or beat out a cross rhythm, remember that these are not just beautiful techniques of individual expression, but also, to many around the world, a crucial language of social emancipation and hope. My simple challenge to you all this week is to listen to the stunning music in the playlist below, and if you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I'd love to chat more about this beautiful music. Apart from that, I bid you all a wonderful rest of the week, and I'll see you next time for much, much more.